The Harley-Davidson sat idling at the red light, engine growling like something alive and furious, when the old man stepped off the curb. He wasn't looking at traffic. He wasn't looking at anything, really, just shuffling forward on legs that seemed to have forgotten their purpose, wearing a cardigan that belonged to a different decade, and holding a paper bag of groceries against his chest like it was the most precious thing left in the world. The light was still red. The biker watched him. Most people didn't. Most people were staring at their phones or adjusting their mirrors or doing that particular thing modern humans do where they look directly at someone in need and somehow manage not to see them at all. But the biker, 6'2", leather jacket covered in patches that told stories most people wouldn't dare ask about, arms like bridge cables, and face like a cliff that had weathered every storm the sky ever invented, he watched the old man stop in the middle of the crosswalk, look down at his groceries, and begin to cry. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly. The way ancient people cry when they've run out of the energy to do it any other way. The light turned green. Nobody moved. Then the biker killed his engine, swung his leg over the seat, and walked into the middle of the intersection. What happened next didn't just change one afternoon in one city. It changed everything. His name was Jake Calloway, and he had been described at various points in his 41 years on this earth as intimidating, reckless, loyal to a fault, and by one particularly brave kindergarten teacher who had known him 3 decades ago. The kind of boy who would either save the world or break it, and Lord help us, we won't know which until it's too late. He'd done a fair amount of both. The motorcycle wasn't just transportation. It was therapy, philosophy, and the closest thing Jake had to a church. He rode it the way some men pray, with his whole body, his whole attention, his whole self surrendered to the motion and the road, and the particular freedom that comes from being suspended between where you've been and where you're going, with no one able to reach you in between. He'd started riding at 19, after his father left. Not left as in walked out the front door, left as in closed his eyes in a hospital bed in Boise, Idaho at 11:47 on a Tuesday morning while the machines around him beeped their steady mechanical grief, and Jake sat in a plastic chair in the corner trying to remember the last real conversation they'd had that wasn't about money or disappointment or the future Jake was supposedly throwing away. He couldn't remember one. That was the thing about grief that nobody warned you about. It wasn't the losing that wrecked you. It was the inventory. All those moments you'd spent on arguments you no longer remembered instead of conversations you'd now give anything to have. After the funeral, Jake had gotten on his father's old bike, a battered 1987 Sportster that leaked oil and kicked like a mule and smelled permanently of gasoline and something else, something that was just his father. And he'd ridden it until the tank was empty, then filled it up and ridden it some more. He hadn't really stopped since. 22 years on the road. For 22 years, he had always been the person at the edge of whatever room he walked into, the person from whom others moved away slightly without knowing why, and the person that security guards watched just a beat too long in convenience stores. He was used to it. He'd even made a kind of peace with it. The leather jacket was a map of his life, patches from places he'd been, rides he'd completed, and clubs he'd briefly joined and then quietly departed from when the belongings started to feel too much like being owned. A purple heart patch in the bottom left corner, half hidden by a crease in the leather, represents the 14 months he spent in places he never talked about, doing things he has since tried to find a counterweight for. He kept mostly to himself. He worked as a mechanic at a shop on the east side of the city. A good mechanic, the kind who could hear a problem before he saw it, who had the particular patience that comes from understanding that machines, like people, mostly just needed someone to listen to what they were trying to say. He lived alone in an apartment above a laundromat, which meant he was always faintly warm and fell asleep most nights to the sound of someone else's tumbling clothes. He had 3 friends, approximately. One was his boss, Ray, who communicated primarily through grunts and appreciated Jake for the same reason. One was a woman named Sandra, who ran the coffee cart 2 blocks from the shop, remembered his order, and never asked him how his day was going, which he considered one of the most generous things one person could do for another. The third was a half-blind basset hound named Corporal, who lived 3 apartments down and greeted Jake in the hallway every morning with a kind of slobbering devotion that Jake found, embarrassingly, to be one of the high points of his week. He was, in the technical sense, lonely, but he didn't call it that. He called it simplicity. He called it preference. He called it the particular freedom of a man who had learned, through significant personal cost, that the more you let people in, the more doors they have to leave through. He was thinking about none of these issues when he pulled up to the red light on the corner of Birchwood and 5th on that Thursday afternoon in October. He was actually thinking about a carburetor. A 1969 Triumph Bonneville carburetor had been giving him trouble all week, and he suspected it had a partially clogged jet, a theory he looked forward to testing when he got back to the shop after running parts. And then the old man stepped off the curb. His name was Albert Novak. He was 83 years old, and he had once been, in roughly chronological order, a paperboy, a high school quarterback, a soldier, a husband, a carpenter, a father, a grandfather, a widower, and, most recently, most painfully, a man who had outlived almost everyone who had known him when he was any of those other things. He'd come to this city 7 years ago after his wife Dorothy died. Their daughter Patricia had insisted. "Come live closer to us, Dad. We have the room. We want you nearby." He'd sold the house in Cleveland where he and Dorothy had lived for 41 years, the house where he'd built the back porch with his hands, where Patricia had learned to walk, and where they'd marked every Christmas and Thanksgiving and ordinary Tuesday evening that makes up the invisible architecture of a life. And he'd moved into a small apartment 15 minutes from Patricia's house. He did not drive anymore. His eyes had announced their retirement 3 years ago, and his doctor had seconded the motion with some emphasis. He walked to the grocery store every Thursday. It was 4 blocks each way, which was, according to his doctor, perfectly reasonable exercise for a man your age, a phrase Albert had noticed doctors used when they were trying to be encouraging but actually just meant, don't push it. He didn't mind the walk. He liked the city in October, especially the autumn light that made everything look beautiful and slightly elegiac, as if the world were doing what he often did, trying to pay proper attention to something before it was gone. What he minded was the weight. The groceries weren't heavy by objective measure. A carton of eggs, 2 cans of soup, a loaf of bread, a small bunch of bananas, and a bottle of apple juice, which his doctor had recommended over orange juice for reasons Albert had been too fully tired to follow. But at 83, after a summer that had been harder than he'd expected, after a fall that had landed him in the hospital for 4 days in August, just a fall, nothing dramatic, just his body reminding him in its blunt and increasingly impatient way that it was no longer the body that had played quarterback or carried lumber or danced with Dorothy at Patricia's wedding. Just a fall had become something he thought about every time he navigated the world without handrails. Patricia had offered to drive him. She always offered. He always said no. He needed this to be something he could still do. He needed to still be able to buy his eggs, bread, and bananas, to stand at the deli counter and exchange pleasantries with a young man whose name he could never quite retain, to walk home through the October air and feel like a man who moved through the world rather than one who was simply waiting in it. He was halfway across the crosswalk on Birchwood and 5th when he stopped. He stopped because his hip, the one that hadn't been quite right since August, sent him a message. The message was unambiguous. The message was, "I am going to require your complete and immediate attention for the next several seconds, and I suggest you stop moving while I have it." Albert stopped moving. He looked down at his grocery bag. He thought about Dorothy. He thought about Dorothy because he often thought about her when things got hard. He had spent the last 7 years doing exactly that, reaching for her in his mind when the world got too heavy, too quiet, or too much, and finding her there reliably and faithfully, the way she had always been reliably faithful in everything, which was one of the 10,000 things about her. He had taken her for granted while she was alive, and had spent every day since trying to make some kind of retroactive peace with what he had done. He thought about the way she used to take grocery bags from his hands before he could protest. "I've got it, Albie. Let me." Not because she doubted him. She did so simply because she enjoyed lending a hand. She understood that true love primarily consisted of showing up for the little things in meaningful ways, without the need for explicit expression. He missed her in the same way you miss something that was also a part of you. Not just in the spaces beside him, but in the empty spaces inside him. In the places where her presence had been so constant and so foundational, that losing her had felt less like bereavement and more like structural damage. Standing in the middle of the crosswalk on Birchwood and 5th, holding his paper bag, his hip sending its insistent messages, the light having turned green in a way he hadn't quite registered, Albert Novak began to cry. He wasn't fully aware he was doing it. That happens sometimes these days. The feelings came before I noticed them. He was aware, distantly, of cars. It was the sound of a motorcycle engine that had been growling and then stopped, of footsteps, and then someone was beside him. Jake wasn't sure what he was going to do when he stepped off the bike. He didn't have a plan. Planning was for situations that gave you time to think, and this one had moved faster than thinking. Green light, old man crying in the crosswalk, feet on the pavement before his brain had finished forming the sentence, somebody should do something. The cars behind him were doing their thing, the hesitation, the building impatience, and someone 2 vehicles back tapping their horn twice in the universal language of what is happening up there. Jake didn't look back. He walked into the intersection. Up close, the old man was smaller than he'd looked from the bike. That was the thing about old people that always caught Jake slightly off guard. How small they could become. How the body that had once carried a whole life through the world could compress itself down to something that looked fragile as paper in the right light. The man had white hair, neatly combed, and a cardigan the color of oatmeal over a button-down shirt. And he was wearing actual dress shoes. Not sneakers, dress shoes. Brown leather ones that someone had polished recently, which, for reasons Jake couldn't immediately name, hit him somewhere in the chest like a hand had reached in and pressed. The man was looking at his groceries. "Hey," Jake said. The man looked up. His eyes, pale blue, the kind of blue that deepens with age instead of fading, registered Jake in layers. First, a massive man in leather. Second, a giant man in leather who was not angry. Third, something else, something unreadable, something that moved across the old man's face like weather. "Hey," Jake said again, softer this time. "You okay?" Albert started, stopped. Albert appeared to be reorganizing something within himself. "My hip, just my hip, I'll be fine in a moment. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." "Don't apologize," Jake said. He looked back at the traffic. A pickup truck had moved around them. The cars behind the motorcycle were doing the thing cars do when they're waiting. The subtle forward creep, the collective tension of machinery waiting to move. "Can I carry that for you?" Albert looked at the bag. Something passed over his face. Some small internal struggle that Jake recognized without being able to name. The particular pride of someone accustomed to managing on their own, encountering a kindness they hadn't prepared a defense against. "I'm going to the Birchwood Arms," Albert said. "Just 4 blocks. I'll walk with you," Jake said. He held out his hand for the bag, and after just a moment, Albert gave it to him. They got out of the intersection. Jake's motorcycle sat at the light, engine off, causing exactly the amount of chaos Jake had expected, which was fine. It was a Thursday afternoon. Nothing was on fire. Everything would sort itself out. They walked. They didn't talk for the first block. Jake held the grocery bag and matched his stride to Albert's, which required a significant reduction in pace that he accomplished without comment. The afternoon light was doing its October thing. Warm and golden and slightly heartbreaking. Leaves were having their annual argument with the wind about staying or going. It was Albert who spoke first. "You have a very loud motorcycle," he said. Jake almost smiled. "I know. My grandson had one for a while. His mother nearly had a heart attack every time he started it." Albert paused. She wasn't wrong to worry, as it turned out. He had an accident. Nothing serious, but enough. "He gave it up?" "He did. I think that was more about the girl he was dating at the time than the accident. She had opinions about motorcycles." Another pause. "And about most other things, as I recall." Jake did smile this time, though Albert was looking ahead and didn't see it. "What happened?" Jake asked, meaning the hip. "August," Albert said, in the tone of a man who had given a full explanation. Then, because Jake waited, "I fell. In the kitchen. There's a threshold between the kitchen and the hallway, just half an inch. I've walked over it 11,000 times, and one evening I didn't obvious it." He shook his head. "Hospital for 4 days. My daughter didn't sleep for a week." He glanced at Jake sideways. "Do you know how it feels to be the reason your child doesn't sleep?" Jake thought about this seriously. "No," he said. "I don't have kids." "It's a particular feeling," Albert said. "It doesn't improve with age." They walked. "I'm Albert," the old man said on the second block. "Jake." "Jake." Albert seemed to try it out. "Thank you, Jake." "It's 4 blocks. Nonetheless." A woman with a stroller passed them going the other direction. A dog, some kind of terrier, full of the irreverent confidence that small dogs carry like a birthright. paused to investigate Jake's boot before its owner dragged it forward. A radio somewhere was playing something old, something with a horn section, something that made Albert's pace slow for just a moment before resuming. "Do you like Chet Baker?" Albert asked. Jake considered the question. "Honestly, I don't know much about him." "That was Chet Baker," Albert said, nodding back toward the radio. "Almost Blue, or possibly My Funny Valentine. They sound similar to me now. My ears aren't what they were." He paused. "Dorothy, that was my wife, loved him. We used to play his records on Sunday mornings. She'd make French toast, and I'd pretend to read the newspaper. And mostly I'd just watch her and listen to Chet Baker." He stopped. The emotion moved across his face again, like visible weather. "She's been gone 7 years." "I'm sorry," Jake said. "Thank you." Albert walked. "You get used to it, they say. I haven't found that to be precisely true. You get different about it. It doesn't go away. It just changes shape." Jake said nothing. He was thinking, without meaning to, about his father. About the last time he'd heard his father's voice on a phone, 4 days before the end. The conversation they'd had been brief and functional, and Jake had ended it by saying, "I'll talk to you this weekend," which had been a lie he'd told himself as much as his father, and which had turned out to be the last thing he'd ever said to him. "Were you married?" Albert asked. Not nosily, just conversationally. The way old people ask things is directly, because they've learned that time spent on indirection is time you can't afford to waste. "No," Jake said. Albert nodded. No follow-up, no judgment. Just a nod that acknowledged the answer without requiring it to be anything other than what it was. Jake found himself, for reasons he couldn't have explained, wanting to say more. "I came close once," he said. "A long time ago." Albert waited. "Her name was Caroline. We were together 4 years. She wanted things I didn't think I could give." He paused. "Or maybe I didn't think I deserved it. I've never been entirely sure which it was." "It's often both," Albert said mildly. "The two have a way of wearing each other's clothes." Jake looked at him. "I was a carpenter for 40 years, Albert said. "I had a particular genius for measuring twice and cutting wrong anyway. Dorothy always said I was very precise about the wrong things." He said it with the particular tenderness of someone quoting a person they love, the kind of quote that functions as both memory and continuing conversation. She wasn't wrong about that either. Third block. The Birchwood Arms came into view, a 6-story brick building, not quite beautiful but solid-looking, the kind of building that had been there long enough to develop a kind of dignity by sheer duration. There were flower boxes in a few of the windows, a small awning over the entrance in green and white. A man in his 50s sitting in a lawn chair beside the front door, reading something, who looked up as they approached. "Mr. Novak," the man said, with the particular warmth of someone who is paid to be warm but has become actually warm over time. "And you've brought company." "Just a neighbor," Albert said, which was not entirely accurate but was apparently the explanation he'd decided to offer. Jake handed the grocery bag to Albert at the door. Albert took it, held it. Albert gazed up at Jake, his pale blue eyes filled with the wisdom of 83 years of experience. "Would you like to come up for coffee?" Albert asked. "I don't have much, but I have coffee. And I believe I have some cookies if Patricia didn't." He stopped. "Please." The place was quiet. It had layers. Jake looked at his motorcycle, still parked 4 blocks back at the corner of Birchwood and 5th, adding to the Thursday afternoon inconvenience of the city with complete automotive indifference. "Yeah," Jake said. "Okay." The apartment was small and very tidy and full of things that had been kept. That was the first thing Jake noticed, the keeping. Not hoarding, nothing like that. Just the particular accumulation of a person who had lived long enough to understand the emotional weight of objects. A framed photo on every surface, a shelf of books that had clearly been read, not displayed. A quilt on the couch that had been washed so many times it had achieved a softness beyond fabric. A pair of women's reading glasses on the side table beside the armchair, set down as if their owner had just stepped out of the room. Dorothy's glasses. Jake understood immediately that Albert had kept them there, that they served a function beyond the material. He didn't comment. The coffee was made in a drip machine that belonged to a previous decade and produced a result that was excellent in the way only old machines make excellent coffee, through some combination of calibration and accumulated character that manufacturers can't reproduce on purpose. They sat, Albert in the armchair, Jake on the couch, with about as much of his surface area covered by the furniture as was geometrically possible, and drank their coffee and looked at the October afternoon through the window. On the side table in the largest frame, a wedding photo. A young man with dark hair and a wide smile, a young woman in white who was laughing at something outside the frame. Both of them caught in a moment of such pure happiness that looking at it felt almost intrusive. Albert caught Jake looking. 1963, Albert said. June 14th. It rained in the morning and cleared up by noon, which Dorothy said was proof that the universe had a sense of theater. He paused. We used to argue about that. I said good weather was just good weather. She said everything meant something if you were paying attention. Another pause. She was right, of course. She usually was. How long were you married? Jake asked. 54 years. Jake did the math. Tried to imagine 54 years of anything. The number made him feel briefly vertiginous, like looking down from somewhere very high. He searched for the word and found only, that's something. It is, Albert said simply. It was everything, really. She was everything. He held his coffee mug in both hands. People say things like that, and they sound like greeting cards. But I mean it in the most literal possible sense. There were years, many of them, where I look back and realize that whatever was good about me in those years was mostly hers. She had a way of reflecting back the best version of you so that you actually lived up to it. You tried to be the person she saw when she looked at you. He shook his head. I haven't always managed it since, without the mirror. Jake sat with his back to the mirror. He was not by nature a man who sat with things comfortably. He preferred motion, action, the particular forward movement of doing something over the stillness of simply being somewhere. But the apartment, and Albert, and the weight of the afternoon, and the coffee, and Dorothy's glasses, sitting on the side table, created a kind of gravity that made stillness feel not just bearable, but somehow right. Tell me about your grandson, Jake said. The one with the motorcycle. Albert's face changed. It went through several stages, something that might have been surprise, then something that resolved into a complicated warmth. Thomas, he said. He's 26 now. He lives in Seattle. He works for a company that does something with computers that I've had explained to me several times and understand not at all. He smiled. He used to come here every other Sunday. We'd watch football. I don't actually enjoy football, but Thomas does. And there is something wonderful about being in the presence of a person's enjoyment, even if you don't share the thing itself. He stopped. He still calls. Usually he calls during his lunch break, Tuesdays. But he doesn't come, Jake said. It wasn't a question exactly. The tense had told him so. Albert looked at his coffee. He moved to Seattle 18 months ago. The job, an opportunity. He said the word carefully, like handling something fragile. I told him to go. I meant it. He's young and the world is wide, and opportunities don't hold their shape if you wait too long. He looked up. I meant it, and I miss him every single day, and both of those things are true simultaneously, which is something they don't warn you about, being old. How many contradictory true things do you have to hold at once? Jake thought about something. It arrived in him sideways, the way the best things do, not as a thought he'd been building toward, but as something that walked in from an unexpected direction. My father died when I was 19, he said. We weren't close. Not at the end. I was angry at him for things that don't even seem important anymore. I spent the last couple years of his life keeping my distance because I thought. He stopped. I thought there was time. I thought distance was a choice I could make and then reverse whenever I wanted. Albert watched him. It's not, Jake said. Distance is a choice. Reversing it is also a choice. But you only get to make the second one if the first one hasn't gone on long enough to become permanent. He looked out the window. I think about that a lot. The things we meant to do, Albert said quietly. Yeah. They sat with it. The afternoon light moved across the floor in a slow, patient way when you're not trying to outrun it. It was Albert who broke the silence, and he did it the way people break silences when they've been working up to something. with a kind of deliberateness that was different from ordinary speech, slower and more careful, like someone approaching a step they're not sure will hold their weight. "Jake," he said, "may I ask you something that might seem strange?" Jake looked at him. "Go ahead." Albert set his coffee mug down. He looked at his hands for a moment, the hands of an 83-year-old carpenter, which meant hands that had done a great deal of work and bore the evidence of it in every line and scar and knuckle. He seemed to be organizing something. "In 3 weeks," he said, "Patricia is having dinner. For my birthday." 84, he said the number with a faint incredulity, as if it still surprised him to be that old. "She's invited her husband Richard, a fine man, Richard, though he talks too much about wine, and the neighbors, whom I like well enough, and Thomas will be calling in over the computer because Seattle is Seattle." He paused. "And she's invited a woman from her book club whose name is Harriet, who has made it very clear to Patricia, and therefore through Patricia to me, that she would like to be introduced. Patricia thinks it would be beneficial for me to have company." His voice was careful. "She means well." "But you would rather not be introduced to Harriet," Jake said. "Harriet is perfectly lovely, I'm sure," Albert said. "But I am 83 years old, and I was married to Dorothy Novak for 54 years. So the idea of—" He stopped. "Rephrase D. I am not lonely in the way Patricia thinks I am. I am lonely for Dorothy. Those are different longitudes." He looked at Jake steadily. "What I would like, and what I would very much like, is to walk into that dinner with someone. Just someone who would be there, who would sit beside me and let Patricia see that I am not a project to be managed." Jake processed the request. "Are you asking me to come to your birthday dinner?" he said carefully. "I'm asking if you would be willing," Albert said. "For one evening. To be well, Patricia knows Thomas won't be there in person, and the neighbors haven't met him. You're about the right age." He looked at Jake directly. "I'm asking if you would be willing to be my grandson for one evening." The apartment was very quiet. Outside, a car passed. Someone's music, faint, something with bass that faded as quickly as it arrived. Jake looked at the wedding photo. At the two people caught mid-laugh in June of 1963, young and unhurt and unaware of anything that was coming. The 54 years, and the daughter Patricia, and the grandson Thomas, and Seattle, and the fall in the kitchen in August, and this Thursday afternoon, and this strange sideways moment in an apartment on the 4th floor of the Birchwood Arms. He looked at Dorothy's glasses on the side table. He looked at Albert. "Tell me more about Thomas," Jake said. Albert's eyes changed. Something in them eased. "He's a good boy," Albert said, and the word boy was 26 years of love compressed into 4 letters. He thought about it the way a craftsman thinks about a piece he's proud of. "He's kind. He doesn't always know who he is, which is the best kind of kindness. He laughs easily. He has Dorothy's eyes. He asks questions about things that don't directly affect him because he's genuinely curious about the world, which is a quality that looks like nothing and is actually everything." Jake listened. "He calls me every Tuesday," Albert continued. 12:30 Pacific Time, 1:30 Mountain, and 2:30 here. Never misses. Occasionally we talk for 5 minutes, occasionally we talk for an hour. He tells me about his work, the things I don't understand. And I tell him about my week, which is considerably simpler. And somehow it works. Somehow it's enough between visits. It's enough to know he's there, that he's—" Albert stopped. "That he remembers. That he hasn't forgotten you," Jake said. "Yes." Albert's voice was very quiet. "That he hasn't forgotten me." Jake put his coffee mug down. He thought about being 19 years old, a hospital room in Boise, a plastic chair in the corner, and the last words he had said to his father. "I'll talk to you this weekend." Over 2 decades of riding roads, fixing engines, living above a laundromat, and befriending a half-blind basset hound, he had come to understand that these words were less a promise than an evasion, a way of leaving a door open without actually walking through it. He thought about all the doors he'd left not quite open and not quite closed, because it was easier than choosing. He thought about Albert walking 4 blocks to the grocery store every Thursday in his polished dress shoes, choosing to still be someone who moved through the world. "Yeah," Jake said. "Okay." Albert looked at him. "I'll come," Jake said. "To your birthday dinner. I'll be your grandson for the evening." Albert Novak, 83 years old, a former paperboy and quarterback and soldier and husband and carpenter and father and grandfather, looked at this large, leather-jacketed, complicated man sitting on his couch, and his pale blue eyes filled with something that was not quite sadness and not quite joy, but contained elements of both. The particular feeling of an unexpected kindness arriving at a moment when you've stopped quite expecting kindness, like rain after a long dry season. "Thank you," he said. Simply. Completely. "Don't mention it," Jake said. And somehow, for reasons neither of them could have fully articulated, they both understood that they were already talking about something much larger than a birthday dinner. They met 3 more times before the dinner. The first time was accidental. Jake happened to be passing the Birchwood Arms on a Saturday morning, on his way to nowhere in particular, which was the kind of riding he did on weekends, and he saw Albert on the front bench with a newspaper and stopped, and they talked for an hour about nothing and everything, the way conversations do when 2 people have already established that they don't need to perform for each other. Albert told him about Cleveland, about the house he'd built the back porch on, and about the way Dorothy used to arrange the flowers from the garden in an old blue vase that Patricia now kept on her windowsill. He told him about Patricia as a child, stubborn, brilliant, and fiercely protective of her father's feelings, in the way that certain daughters are, the ones who understand before anyone tells them that fathers are more fragile than they look. Jake told him about the army, not the things he never talked about, but the edges of them. The way the desert had looked in the early morning, before the heat arrived, when everything was the color of milk glass. The particular quality of silence in places where silence is also a form of danger. The way you learned in those places to pay attention to everything, because the things you didn't notice were the things that could end you. "Did it change you?" Albert asked. "Everything changes you," Jake said. "That's more." Albert nodded, as if this were a complete and satisfactory answer, which Jake appreciated, because it was. The second meeting was intentional. Albert called the number Jake had left. He'd written it on a piece of paper, the old way, with a pen, which Albert had folded and put in his cardigan pocket like something valuable, and asked if Jake might like to come for dinner on Wednesday. He made pasta, real pasta made from scratch, which he explained Dorothy had taught him in 1974 after a trip they'd taken to Florence, which he described in enough detail that Jake found himself almost able to see the streets, the food, the hotel, with the courtyard where they'd eaten breakfast for 5 days. And Dorothy had practiced her Italian with the waiter, who had been charmed and who had possibly been more charmed than the Italian strictly warranted. Jake ate 2 plates of pasta and listened to stories about Florence and felt something in the region of his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time, which was the particular warmth of being somewhere you are genuinely welcome. He washed the dishes. Albert protested. Jake washed them anyway. The third meeting was on the Sunday before the dinner. Jake had brought the parts he'd ordered, a better grip for the bottom rail of Albert's front-facing window, which he'd noticed sticking the second time he visited, and a replacement bulb for the reading lamp that had been flickering. He fixed both in 40 minutes. Albert watched him work with the appreciative attention of one craftsman recognizing the work of another. "You're good with your hands," Albert said. "Raised by a man who was good with his hands," Jake said before he'd quite decided to say it. "I fought it for years, then I stopped fighting it." Albert said, "The things our fathers give us are sometimes the things we refuse most energetically before we accept them." Jake looked up from the window grip. "Did Thomas fight it? What you gave him?" Albert smiled. "Oh, relentlessly. For years, he wanted nothing to do with working with his hands. He was going to be intellectual. He was going to be a person who thought for a living." The smile deepened. "Then I watched him spend 3 hours last Christmas before he moved, fixing something on his computer that was going wrong. Taking it apart piece by piece, working through it systematically, getting it right, and then taking it apart again to understand why it was right." He paused. I didn't say anything, but I recognized it. "Yeah," Jake said. "You would." They had coffee again. Albert showed Jake a photo album, the physical kind, pages of thick paper with photos held in by corners, because Albert was 83, and photo albums had existed in physical form for essentially all of it. Jake turned the pages slowly. Dorothy at 24, laughing in a garden. At 30, Albert held newborn Patricia as if she were something he did not quite trust himself not to drop. Patricia at 7, 8, 10, 12, growing through the pages in the particular jerky time-lapse of photographs, which skip the Tuesday afternoons and keep only the moments someone thought to document. Thomas. He appears at the back of the album, first as a newborn, then as a toddler, and finally as a boy with Dorothy's pale blue eyes and Albert's wide smile. He looks like both of you, Jake said. Dorothy always said that was the best thing, Albert said, when the people you love the most are with the same person. Jake turned to the last page. The last photo in the album was recent, the previous Christmas, according to Albert, the one before Thomas left for Seattle. Albert and Thomas sat side by side on this very couch, with Thomas's arm around Albert's shoulder, both looking at the camera. Albert was smaller in the photo, or the same, but Thomas was large and young and vital beside him, and the contrast was not sad. It was right. It was the right relationship between a person's seasons. Jake stared at it for a long moment. He loves you, Jake said. I know, Albert said, and I love him. We're fine, Thomas and I. I want to be clear, Jake. This isn't about Thomas. Thomas calls on Tuesdays, and I am very glad he does. He paused. The dinner is about Patricia. And what about Harriet from the book club? And about the particular way Patricia worries, which comes from love but wears the clothes of management, and from which, at 83, at 84, I would simply like a small reprieve. He looked at Jake with those pale blue eyes. Does that make sense? It makes perfect sense, Jake said. He closed the photo album gently, handed it back. Tell me what Thomas is like, Jake said. Tell me enough that I won't embarrass you. And Albert Novak sat back in his armchair and told Jake Calloway everything about his grandson, slowly and carefully and lovingly, in the way you describe something you don't want to get wrong. And Jake listened and filed it away, and tried not to notice that somewhere between the carbonator problem, and the crosswalk, and the pasta, and the photo album, this had stopped being about one evening and had become something else entirely. The birthday dinner was on a Saturday. Jake wore the closest thing he owned to civilian clothes, dark jeans without tears, a button-down flannel shirt, and boots that were clean. He'd shaved, which caused Ray at the shop to do a visible double-take when Jake came in Friday morning. He left his leather jacket at home, replacing it with a canvas jacket that his reflection informed him made him look approximately 40% less like someone you'd cross the street to avoid. He arrived at the Birchwood Arms at 6:15, 15 minutes before Patricia was due. Albert opened the door. He was wearing a suit. He wore an actual charcoal gray suit, a dark blue tie with a very small pattern, and freshly polished dress shoes. He had combed his white hair, and he was carrying himself differently than he had in the crosswalk. Straighter, more deliberate, like a man who has decided to meet something squarely. He looked at Jake. Jake looked at him. You look terrible, Albert said warmly. But thank you for trying. You look like you're going to a funeral, Jake said. In a good way. Albert almost laughed. Come in. Patricia will be here soon. Her husband Richard will talk about wine. Just nod. Jake came in. The apartment had been tidied beyond its usual tidiness. There were flowers in a blue vase on the table. The blue vase, the one that had been Dorothy's, that Patricia now kept but had apparently lent back for the occasion. There were candles. There was something cooking that smelled extraordinary, which Jake identified as a roast of some kind. You cooked all this? Jake said. Patricia brought most of it, Albert said. She's well organized. He said it with the particular combination of pride and mild exasperation that Jake had come to understand was the register Albert used when talking about his daughter. She'll be managing everything the moment she walks in. That's simply who she is. And you love her for it, Jake said. Tremendously, Albert said. She is an extraordinary person. She is also occasionally exhausting. He paused. Don't tell her I said that. I'm playing your grandson for the evening, Jake said. I think family loyalty is implied. Albert looked at him with those blue eyes, and something moved in them that was more than amusement. The elevator dinged in the hallway, voices. Albert put his hand briefly on Jake's arm. Just a touch, just a second, and then straightened his tie and went to the door. Patricia Novak Amos was 56, with her father's pale eyes and her mother's apparently irrepressible warmth, and she swept into the apartment with the velocity of someone who has been organizing things mentally for the entire drive over. Behind her came Richard Ames, a pleasant-faced man in his 60s with the genial, slightly bewildered expression of a man who has been married to an organizing force for 30 years and has made his peace with it. carrying wine and what appeared to be 2 casserole dishes and a cake box. Behind Richard came Harriet from the book club, who was perhaps 70, silver-haired, and was looking around the apartment with the bright interest of someone who has been told something specific about why they've been invited and is not entirely sure how to calibrate themselves accordingly. Patricia said hello to her father, handed him something, turned to the table, said something about the flowers, turned back, and saw Jake. There was a pause. A brief, exact pause that contained several things at once. The recalibration, the recognition that something was unexpected, the rapid assessment that precedes either alarm or welcome. "Dad," she said evenly, "you didn't mention you'd invited someone." "I didn't?" Albert said this with a particular innocence that Jake recognized as a performance. "I could have sworn I mentioned Thomas couldn't make it in person, but that his friend would be joining us. Jake, you know Patricia." It was not what they'd discussed. Jake absorbed the news without blinking. "Nice to meet you," Jake said, and put out his hand. "Jake, I've heard a lot about you." Patricia shook his hand. She was looking at him with the assessing intelligence of a woman who knew her father extremely well. "Have you?" she said. "Not a question exactly." "Your father talks about you constantly," Jake said. This was true. "He says you're an extraordinary person. Also true and occasionally exhausting." He delivered this last part with a careful half-smile and watched it land perfectly. Patricia's expression moved through startlement into a laugh she wasn't quite expecting to have. "That sounds exactly like him," she said. "It did come with the caveat that I wasn't to tell you," Jake said, "which you immediately told me." "I'm bad at keeping secrets." Patricia looked at her father. Albert was looking at the flowers, the picture of innocence. "Sit down," Patricia said to the room at large. "I'll get everything on the table. Dad, where's the—" She was already moving, already managing, and the evening unfolded the way evenings do when they've been organized by someone who knows how to organize them. Richard did, in fact, talk about wine. Jake nodded. Albert had prepared him well. Harriet from the book club turned out to be interesting in ways Jake hadn't anticipated. She was a retired linguistics professor with opinions about everything and a complete lack of interest in moderating them, which meant that within 20 minutes, she and Richard were in a spirited disagreement about something to do with the English language that was never quite resolved but seemed to generate considerable energy for both participants. Patricia served the dinner. There was the roast Jake had smelled, beautifully done, with potatoes and some kind of glazed vegetable, and bread and salad and wine that Richard had selected and described in vocabulary Jake made no effort to follow. And at the end of the table next to Jake, Albert ate his birthday dinner in his charcoal suit and watched his daughter manage the evening and listened to Richard and Harriet disagree and participated gently when drawn in and was, Jake could see it clearly, genuinely happy. Not the performed happiness of someone enduring an occasion. Real happiness, the kind that comes from being surrounded by people and warmth and the smell of good food. From being the reason an evening exists, from being celebrated in the particular language of presence. People showing up, sitting down, and eating together, which is one of the oldest and most fundamental things humans do to say, "You matter. You are here. We are glad." Jake had not expected to feel as much as he was feeling. He'd come to do a thing, a decent, relatively simple thing for an old man who'd asked nicely. He'd expected it to be fine. Somewhat awkward at the edges, but fine. What he hadn't expected was to find himself at this table, this particular table with its blue vase and its candles and the weight of everything Albert had told him, 54 years, and Dorothy, and Patricia, and Thomas, and Cleveland, and Florence, and the back porch he'd built, and feel something that he hadn't quite felt before, or hadn't felt in so long he'd stopped expecting it, like he was somewhere he was supposed to be. It was as if the road had led here, to this specific table, on this specific evening, in a way that was not random. He was quiet for most of the dinner. He listened. He laughed when the laughter was right. He passed the bread and refilled Albert's water glass without being asked, and once, just once, when Patricia said something that landed with a gentle sharpness about Albert's independence, carefully worded, lovingly meant, but still a small taking over, a small managing, Jake said quietly, "He's very good at taking care of himself, you know. He made pasta from scratch on Wednesday that I'd drive 2 hours to eat again." Patricia looked at him. "Dorothy's recipe," Albert said mildly. Something moved across Patricia's face. The mention of Dorothy did that. Jake had noticed it the moment she walked in. The particular way the apartment recalibrated around Dorothy's absence, and how the blue vase full of flowers had stopped Patricia for just a moment before she started managing things. "I know he is," Patricia said quietly. "I know, Dad." She put her hand over Albert's on the table. Albert put his other hand over hers. Jake looked at the candles. At 8:45, Albert's phone rang. He looked at the screen. Something changed in his face. "It's Thomas," he said. Patricia said, "Answer it, Dad. Put it on speaker if he wants." Albert answered it. The voice that came through was young and warm and slightly breathless, the way voices sound when you're calling from somewhere across a time zone because you remembered your grandfather's birthday and you called specifically for it. "Grandpa, happy birthday. I'm so sorry I can't be there." "Thomas," Albert said. His voice did something Jake hadn't heard it do before. It simplified somehow, became more purely itself. "Thank you for calling." 84. "You're ridiculous, you know that." 84. "It surprised me too," Albert said. He was smiling. "Is everyone there? Is Mom there?" "Everyone's here," Patricia said. "Hi, sweetheart." "Hey, Mom. Hey, Richard. Is Harriet there?" Dad said. "I'm here," Harriet said brightly. "Fantastic. Mom, is the Harriet thing still?" "Thomas," Patricia said quickly. "Right. Got it. Sorry." A beat. Then, curiously, "Who's the other person?" Mom said someone else was coming. A very brief silence at the table. Everyone looked at Albert. Albert looked at Jake. Jake looked at the phone. Something happened in him, some calculation, some decision. Though it didn't quite feel like a decision. It felt more like recognition, the way you recognize a road you've been down before. He leaned slightly toward the phone. "Hey, Thomas," he said. "I'm Jake." A pause on the other end. "Jake." Thomas's voice was carefully neutral in the way that voices get carefully neutral when they're doing rapid assessment. "Are you a friend of my grandfather's?" "Working on it," Jake said. Another pause, then slowly. "How did you two meet?" "He walked into traffic," Jake said. "I stopped to help. He invited me for coffee and made excellent pasta. Now I'm at his birthday dinner." He paused. The story got away from me somewhere in the middle. On the other end of the phone, Thomas laughed. Not the careful laugh of someone who is polite. An actual laugh. Surprised. Genuine. The kind that comes out before you've decided to let it. "That is so completely something he would do," Thomas said. "Walk into traffic and end up with a new person." "Jake was very helpful," Albert said, speaking with the dignity of a man who has decided to own his narrative. "Grandpa, I am not judging you. I'm just saying you are consistently the most. Do you have any idea how much like you that is? Is it safe to walk into a crosswalk and come home with a friend?" Albert looked at the word, not out loud, but Jake could see him receive it. Friend. "He has a very loud motorcycle," Albert told Thomas. "Of course he does," Thomas said. There was something warm in it now. The carefulness had dropped away. "Jake, is that the original plan here? Are you just a friend or is there something—" "Thomas," Albert said, and the word carried about 30 years of grandparental authority. "Right. Got it. Jake, please take care of him. He's difficult." "I've noticed," Jake said. "Good. Difficult. The best kind." A brief pause. "It's wonderful you're there. He talks about needing to still do things himself, and from Seattle I can't." The sentence didn't quite finish. Didn't need to. "It's good you're there." Jake said nothing. He was looking at Albert, who was looking at the phone with an expression that was so full of so many things at once that looking directly at it felt, again, like something intrusive. Some privacy, a feeling that deserved its space. "Grandpa," Thomas said. "Happy birthday. I love you. I'm sorry I can't be there." "You're here," Albert said. "You're right here." "Next month," Thomas said, with the firmness of someone making a commitment. "I'm coming. I'm booking it this week. I'll be there." "You don't have to. I'm booking it this week." Albert's smile then. It was wide and uncomplicated, and it lasted for 26 years of love. "All right," he said. "Book it." They said goodnight. The phone call ended. The table was quiet for a moment. Then Patricia said softly, "He's coming next month." "He said so," Albert said. Patricia looked at Jake. He wasn't sure what the look contained exactly, but it was assessing, and it was grateful, and it was something else. Some question she hadn't decided whether to ask. She decided not to ask it. More wine? She said, reaching for the bottle. They ate cake. Albert's cake was chocolate because it had been his cake every year since 1958 when Dorothy had made it for his birthday in their first apartment. And he'd said it was perfect, and she'd never seen a reason to change it. Patricia had made it from Dorothy's recipe. It was, Jake could confirm, perfect. Harriet and Richard left at 10, with warmth and goodwill, and an unresolved argument about linguistics that seemed to have energized both of them considerably. Patricia stayed to clear things up. Jake helped. They moved around the kitchen with the quiet efficiency of two people who are using the work to think about other things, while Albert sat in the armchair with his second cup of decaf and watched the candles burn down. "How did you really meet him?" Patricia asked Jake, quietly, while Albert was out of earshot. Jake told her. The motorcycle, the crosswalk, the grocery bag, the 4 blocks. Patricia was quiet for a moment, drying a dish in the careful way she did everything. "He didn't tell me about the hip," she said. "He's very private," Jake said carefully, "about the things he still needs to be able to do himself." Patricia looked at the dish. I do know that." She paused. "I worry about him, living here alone. The fall in August." She stopped. "He's 83. I call every day and he always says he's fine, and he usually is, and still He is fine," Jake said. He's more than fine." He searched for the right word. "He's still very much himself. Very much here. He just needs to be allowed to be that." Patricia looked at him. "You've known him for 3 weeks." "Yes," Jake said. "And you're telling me how to understand my father." "I'm telling you what I see," Jake said. "From the outside. Sometimes the outside sees things that the inside is too close to." A silence. "I know," Patricia said. And then, quietly, "Thank you for being here. For whatever this is." She glanced toward the living room, where Albert was in his armchair with his decaf. "He laughed tonight. I don't mean he was cheerful. I mean he laughed, genuinely, several times." She looked back at Jake. "He doesn't do that as much as he used to, this year especially." Jake didn't have an answer for this. He didn't try to make one. Patricia finished drying the dish, put it away. "Will you keep in touch with him after tonight?" Jake thought about Tuesdays, about pasta from scratch, about the window grip he'd fixed, about the photo album and Dorothy's glasses on the side table, and the way Albert had said, "You're right here," to his grandson over the phone. "Yes," he said. "I will." Patricia left at 10:30. She kissed her father's cheek and held his hands for a moment in both of hers, and something passed between them, wordless, specific, the private language of parents and children that develops over decades and which communicates entire volumes without a sentence. "Next month," she reminded him. "Thomas." "I heard him," Albert said. "I know you heard him. I'm reminding you." She kissed him again. "Happy birthday, Dad." She shook Jake's hand at the door. The handshake lasted a moment longer than a standard handshake, which Jake understood was carrying information. "Good night," she said. "And thank you." She left. The apartment was quiet. Jake and Albert sat, Jake on the couch, Albert in his armchair, in the aftermath of the evening, which had that particular texture of warmth that collects in rooms after people have been content in them. "Well," Albert said. "Well," Jake said. "That went better than expected." "Harriet seemed disappointed," Jake said. "Harriet will survive," Albert said mildly. "She's a very resilient woman." He paused. "Thomas liked you." "Thomas seemed like a good person." "He is," Albert said. "He's very—" He stopped, changed direction. "You know, when he calls on Tuesdays, he always asks how I'm eating, whether I'm sleeping well, whether my hip is better or not. He asks exactly the right questions, in the right order, without making me feel examined." He paused. "You ask questions the same way." Jake looked at him. "It's a particular skill," Albert continued. "Asking a question that shows I care about you without saying I'm worried about you. Because the first one is a gift and the second one is a weight." He held his decaf. "Not everyone learns it." Jake thought about his father. He thought about the questions he hadn't asked, the questions that had gone unasked, and all the weight they had both been carrying instead of the gift they could have given. "I'm learning," Jake said. Quietly. Jake spoke as much to the room as he did to Albert. Albert nodded, as if this were a sufficient and complete answer, which it was. The candles on the table had burned down to small flames over pools of wax. The blue vase with its flowers. Dorothy's glasses on the side table. The photograph, the one from 1963. The young man with dark hair and the woman in white who was laughing at something outside the frame. Albert, Jake said. Yes. Why did you really ask me? There must have been, I don't know, other options. Patricia's friends, neighbors, whatever. Why me? Albert considered the question. Because, he said finally, when I was standing in that crosswalk in the middle of traffic, holding my bag and missing Dorothy and hurting, not coping, honestly, not managing it, everyone around me did what people do. They looked away, or they looked and kept moving. He paused. And you stopped. You left your motorcycle in the intersection, and you walked over. And you didn't ask if I needed help. You just helped. He looked at Jake steadily. People who help without asking, who perform the gesture without announcing it, are rare. They're the kind of person who was taught something important, or who taught themselves something important at considerable cost. He paused again. I wanted to know you better. I wanted to repay it somehow, though I'm not sure a birthday dinner is an adequate exchange for getting a man off a crosswalk. It's more than adequate, Jake said. Good. Albert set down his mug. Then I'm satisfied. They sat. Can I ask you something? Jake said. Of course. The glasses, Jake said, gently. Dorothy's glasses, on the side table. Albert looked at them. Why there? Jake asked. Albert was quiet for a long moment. Because that's where she left them, he said. The last evening, she'd been reading. She put them down to come to bed. In the morning He stopped. I couldn't move them. I tried it once a few months later. Patricia thought I should. I picked them up and held them for about 30 seconds, and then I put them back. He looked at Jake. It probably seems morbid. No, Jake said. It seems like love. Albert's eyes filled. He didn't look away. Yes, he said. It is. Jake got up to go at 11. He'd gathered his canvas jacket, said goodnight to the flowers and the photographs in the way one does when leaving a place that has accumulated weight, and he was at the door when Albert said from the armchair, Jake. He turned. Albert was holding something. A book, small, hardcover, dark blue, the kind of book that had been held so many times its spine was silk. This book was my father's, Albert said. Marcus Aurelius, Meditations. He held it out. I've read it so many times that the words have almost worn through the pages. My father read it before me. I gave Thomas a copy, a new modern translation, when he graduated. He paused. I'd like you to have this one. Jake looked at the book in Albert's hands. That's... Albert, I can't take that. I want you to have it, Albert said, with the calm certainty of someone who has thought this through before arriving at it. These things need to go somewhere they'll be needed, and I think you might need it. He paused. My father used to say that the Meditations was a book for men who were still in the middle of figuring out how to be. This is not a book for people who have their lives sorted, for the ones still in the process. He looked at Jake. You're in the process. Jake crossed the room and took the book. It was worn in a way that only decades of reading can wear something, not degraded, but rather brought to its essence. He opened it to a random page. The margins were full of handwriting, small and precise. Notes, observations, references to other pages, crossed out words, and reinstated ones. A lifetime of reading, recorded in pencil. He closed it carefully. Thank you, he said. And the words were inadequate, and both of them knew it, and it was fine. Albert walked him to the door. They stood at it for a moment, Jake with his canvas jacket and the book, Albert in his charcoal suit that he was still wearing perfectly at 11 o'clock in the evening, because Albert Novak had decided to meet this particular occasion squarely. Same time next week, Albert said. What? Coffee. I thought perhaps next Thursday. I'm making soup. Jake looked at him. He tried to find something to say that was larger than what he was feeling, but couldn't, so he instead asked, Do you want me to bring anything? Bread, Albert said. That bakery on Morrow Street, the sourdough. Done, Jake said. Albert extended his hand. Jake took it. They shook hands, and it was just a handshake. It was technically only a handshake, but it lasted long enough and contained enough to be something else besides. "Good night, Jake," Albert said. "Good night, Albert." Jake walked down the hall. At the elevator, he looked back. Albert was still standing in the doorway. When he saw Jake look back, he raised one hand. Not a wave, exactly. Just a hand raised. Just an acknowledgement. The old man in his birthday suit, with white hair and pale blue eyes, watched someone go from the doorway of his apartment. Jake raised his hand back. The elevator came. He rode it down to the lobby, walked out into the October night, and stood for a moment on the sidewalk in front of the Birchwood Arms, looking up at the sky, which was clear and enormous, and full of the particular cold brilliance of a fall night in the city, stars visible even through the light pollution, faint but there. He held Albert's father's book in one hand. He thought about 19 and a hospital room in Boise. He thought about all the doors he'd left not quite open and not quite closed. He thought about distance being a choice, and reversing it being a choice, and the window between those choices being finite in ways you don't fully understand until it isn't. He got on his motorcycle. He sat there for a moment without starting it, listening to the city, traffic and wind, and somewhere a piece of music, something with a horn section, old and sweet and full of longing, which might have been Chet Baker or might have been anything, but which Jake decided, on no particular evidence, to call Almost Blue. Then he started the engine, rode home through the October night, parked the bike, went upstairs, sat at his kitchen table with Albert's father's book open in front of him, with the pencil-filled margins, the worn pages, and the quiet accumulated wisdom of multiple lifetimes of reading, and read until 3 in the morning, underlining nothing, because the book already had everything it needed. Thomas came in November. He flew in on a Thursday, took a cab to the Birchwood Arms, and was apparently on Albert's doorstep for approximately 4 minutes before Albert called Jake. Not to tell him Thomas had arrived, just to tell him that he was making pasta, the Dorothy kind, and that there was enough for 3 if Jake wasn't busy. Jake wasn't busy. He met Thomas Novak at Albert's kitchen table, where Thomas was already installed with a beer from Albert's refrigerator, wearing a flannel shirt, blue, similar weight to Jake's, and looking so much like the photo at the back of the album, with Dorothy's eyes and Albert's smile, that Jake had a brief, entirely unexpected moment of disorientation, as if time had folded over itself. "You're the motorcycle guy," Thomas said, putting out his hand. Jake said, "You're the Seattle guy." "Guilty." Thomas's handshake was firm and uncalibrated, typical of someone who didn't think too hard about it. "Grandpa talks about you. Good things, hopefully. He said you fixed his window and you asked good questions." Thomas considered. "From him, that's basically a marriage proposal." "Thomas," Albert said from the stove. "Sorry, Grandpa." They ate pasta at the small table, the 3 of them, which was somewhat cramped and entirely fine. Thomas talked about Seattle with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loved a place rather than merely lived in it. He asked Jake about the shop, about the motorcycle, about mechanics generally, with the particular interest of someone who, Jake was coming to understand, was drawn to the logic of systems, the way things came apart and went back together. Albert ate his pasta and listened and occasionally inserted a comment that was brief and targeted and always landed exactly right, the way a skilled carpenter hits a nail. Once, cleanly, without excess. After dinner, Thomas and Jake washed up while Albert sat in his armchair. Through the kitchen doorway, Jake could see the old man watching them. The particular expression on his face was one that Jake would think about for a long time afterward. Not just happiness, something beyond happiness. Something that looked like completion, like a man seeing something he'd hoped for and hadn't been entirely sure he'd get. Like a man watching a room he loves being full. Thomas left Sunday. He shook Jake's hand at the door of the Birchwood Arms in front of Albert and said, "Tuesday. He calls you on Thursdays." I confirmed. He paused. "Don't let him skip the walks. He'll try to skip the walks when the weather gets awful." "I know," Jake said. "He's stubborn. I've noticed. He gets it from Dorothy." Thomas glanced at Albert. "Though he'll deny it." He looked back at Jake. "Thank you, really, for whatever this is, for showing up." "He showed up first," Jake said. Thomas nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "He would." Winter came. The walks got harder. Albert didn't skip them. Jake started driving, not riding, but driving, in the actual truck he owned, but mostly ignored past the Birchwood Arms on Thursday afternoons. Not to watch, not to manage. Just to be in the vicinity, the way you are in the vicinity of something you want to keep an eye on without making a performance of it. The first time Albert caught him doing this, peeking up from his bench and seeing the truck idling at the corner, he said nothing until the following Thursday when Jake arrived for coffee and soup. "You drive very slowly past my building," Albert said, pouring coffee. "Traffic," Jake said. "There is no traffic on that block." "New traffic. Recent." Albert set the coffee in front of him. "Jake." "Albert." "I appreciate it," Albert said simply. Jake picked up his coffee. "The soup smells good." "Tomato bisque," Albert said. "Dorothy's recipe." He sat down. "Everything is Dorothy's recipe. I realize I have been feeding you exclusively on her catalog for 2 months." "It's an excellent catalog," Jake said. They drank their coffee. Outside, the first real snow of winter was arriving, the hesitant kind, the exploratory snow that comes before the city accepts winter and commits to it. "Can I tell you something?" Jake said. "You can tell me anything." "I called my father's sister, my Aunt Carol. I haven't spoken to her since the funeral. 22 years. Albert watched him. "I don't know why I called her, He paused. "I do know. I've been reading that book. Your father's book. Marcus Aurelius mentions wasted time in that work. He discusses the individuals we steer clear of and the narratives we construct to rationalize our actions." He held his coffee mug. "I've been telling myself a story about my father that ended before it should have. And Carol was close to him. She knew him. She knew things about him I don't know because I left before I could learn them." "What did she say?" Albert asked, quietly. "She cried," Jake said. "And then she talked for an hour. About my dad. About who he was before I was old enough to have an opinion about it." He paused. Apparently he was funny. I'd forgotten that. He was genuinely funny, the dry kind, the kind you have to pay attention to catch." He paused. "He tried," Carol said. "In the last couple years, he tried. He just didn't know how to say the thing he wanted to say, and so he said adjacent things instead, and I was too young and too angry to hear what the adjacent things meant." Albert said nothing. "Let it sit." "I can't fix it," Jake said. "He's been gone 22 years and I can't fix it, but—" He stopped. "But I can know him better than I did. Even now, even after. And that's—" He looked up. "It's something. It's not nothing." "It's very far from nothing," Albert said. Jake nodded. Outside, the snow was committing. "You know what I think?" Albert said. "Tell me." "I think you have been moving very quickly your whole life," Albert said. "The motorcycle, the roads, the shop, the apartment, He gestured, something that encompassed the whole of the abbreviated life Jake had described over the past weeks. Moving, always forward, which is not wrong. Motion is not wrong. But, he paused. But sometimes what's behind you is worth going back for, not to stay, just to pick up what you left there, the things that are still yours. Jake sat with this for a long time. The snow moved past the window. The coffee cooled. Albert waited because he had learned, over 83 years, and 54 of them with Dorothy, and the rest in the long work of being a person in the world, that the best thing you can do for someone in the middle of something is to be present while they work through it. "I want to be Thomas for real," Jake said finally. Albert looked at him. "Not play a role," Jake said. He paused. "I don't have grandparents. Mine died when I was young. My father's side, we lost touch. My mother's parents, I barely knew." He looked at Albert steadily. I'm not saying," he stopped. Tried again. "I'm saying that Thursdays are the best part of my week, and I want them to keep being that." The apartment was hushed. "Jake," Albert said. "Yes." "For a man who fixes things for a living," Albert said gently, "you are sometimes very slow to accept when something is already working." Jake looked at him. "The Thursdays were already real," Albert said. "They became real approximately 45 seconds into the walk from that crosswalk to this building." He met Jake's eyes. "I don't have a grandson in this city. Thomas is in Seattle, and I am very glad he is building his life there. But I am also 83 years old, and I live alone, and I have a hip that reminds me of its opinions on a daily basis, and I would very much like, if it suits you, for you to be the person who comes on Thursdays." Jake said nothing. "Not a performance," Albert said. "Not a role. Just a person who comes on Thursdays and drinks my coffee and fixes things I don't tell Patricia are broken and argues with me about Marcus Aurelius and drives past my building in traffic that doesn't exist." He paused. "Is that something you can manage?" Jake looked at his coffee, looked at the window where the snow was now fully committed, covering the city in white, looked at the side table with the reading glasses, looked at Albert. "Yes," he said. "That's something I can manage." Albert nodded. Once. The nod of a craftsman who has checked something for level and found it true. "Good," he said. "Now eat your soup before it gets cold." Spring arrived the way spring always arrives in cities. Suddenly, almost insultingly, after you've been cold long enough to forget that warmth exists. Jake rode his motorcycle to the Birchwood Arms for the first time since October. The sound of the Harley drew Albert to his window, 4 floors up, and when Jake looked up, the old man was there, watching. And when Jake raised his hand, Albert raised his back. The same gesture, the same unwaved wave, the same acknowledgement of presence. Jake parked, went up. Albert was making coffee. "You brought the bike," Albert said. "First decent day," Jake said. "I thought you were a man who rode in all weather." "I've been going soft," Jake said. "Someone's been feeding me soup." Albert made a sound that might have been a laugh. They had coffee. Albert was better this spring than he'd been in the fall. The hip had improved. The physical therapy Patricia had finally convinced him to attend had done its job. And there was something else too. Something lighter in the way he moved through the apartment. Less careful, more certain. "Thomas is coming in April," Albert said. "He mentioned, he texted me." Albert turned. "He texted you?" "He has my number, from November." Jake paused. "We text sometimes, about you mostly. He likes updates." Albert stared at him for a moment. "I have created a support network," he said finally. "You walked into a crosswalk," Jake said. "It had consequences." Albert sat down in his armchair in the spring light with his coffee. He looked at the photograph from 1963, the young man with dark hair and the woman in white, laughing. He looked at the glasses on the side table. He looked at Jake, large and slightly windburned from the ride, sitting on his couch with his coffee. "Dorothy would have liked you," Albert said. Jake looked up. "She liked people who were still becoming," Albert said. "She said there was nothing more intriguing in the world than a person who was still figuring themselves out. People who thought they were finished." He shook his head. "She had no patience for that. But a person in motion, in the real sense, someone actually working at it." He paused. "She would have liked you." Jake looked at the photograph for a long moment. "I would have liked her," he said. "I know," Albert said. "I can tell." In May, Jake drove Albert to Cleveland. It was Albert's idea. He'd been talking about it for weeks. Not dramatically, not as a major announcement, just circling it the way he circled things he wanted to do but wasn't quite ready to commit to. The house, the back porch. He hadn't been back since he'd sold it 7 years ago. Patricia didn't know they were going. Jake had asked Albert if he should tell her. Albert had said, "Let's go first and tell her after. She'll worry, and the worrying won't help anyone." Jake had said, "She'll be furious." Albert had said, "Yes, but she'll also understand. She's excellent at those two things happening simultaneously." They drove. Jake was in the truck, Albert in the passenger seat with his blue Marcus Aurelius, the new one, the Thomas one, because Jake now had the old one and had read it 4 times, the margins full of Jake's own pencil notes talking back to Albert's father's pencil notes across 50 years. It was a 5-hour drive. They talked for most of it. About Cleveland and Dorothy and the things Albert had built over 40 years. Not just the back porch, but everything. The shelves. Patricia had asked for the playhouse he'd built for Thomas when he was 5. The repairs and adjustments, and small constructions that add up, over a life, to a profound record of what you chose to spend your time doing. About Jake's father. About the stories Carol had been telling him. 1 phone call per week over the winter. Rebuilding a person Jake had thought he'd lost access to, and discovering that the loss had been partial, that a significant amount of his father was still recoverable if he were willing to do the work. About the things you carry, and the things you put down, and the art of knowing which is which. The whole thing had been about love since the beginning. The house was in a neighborhood that had changed and hadn't changed. the specific mixture of time that makes returning to places complicated. The house itself was smaller than Albert's memory of it, which was not a surprise. Homes always shrink when you've been carrying them at their original size for years. The current owners, a young couple with a toddler, came to the door when they saw Albert standing on the sidewalk. Jake had been prepared for this moment to go in any of several directions. He'd been prepared to explain, to smooth it over, to manage whatever happened. What happened was that the woman, perhaps 30, genuinely warm, said, "Oh, you must be the family that lived here before. Please come in." Albert stepped into his former house. Jake stayed on the sidewalk, giving him the space. He was out there for perhaps 20 minutes. Jake waited, watching the street, the neighborhood, and an ordinary April afternoon. When Albert came out, he was carrying something. A small plant, a cutting from something in the garden, wrapped in a damp paper towel, which the young woman had apparently pressed on him when he mentioned that Dorothy had planted the original. He walked down the front path. "The back porch is still there," he said when he reached Jake. His voice was steady. "They've added furniture. It looks like they use it. They actually use it." He looked at the plant in his hands. Dorothy would be very glad about that. "What's the plant?" Jake asked. "Lavender," Albert said. "She planted it the summer Patricia was born. She said it was for good luck." He looked at it. "Apparently, it's very vigorous." They stood on the sidewalk in front of the house for a moment. "You okay?" Jake asked. "Yes," Albert said, meaning it. "Yes, I am." They drove back. Albert slept for most of the return trip. The quiet, uncomplicated sleep of a man who has done something necessary and is resting after it. Jake drove through the evening, the highway unspooling ahead of them in the way highways do, the city lights accumulating on the horizon. He thought about roads. He'd always considered the road to be the thing between places, the motion between arrivals, the freedom of the in-between where you were neither here nor there and therefore couldn't be pinned down or disappointed or lost. He thought about what Albert had said in the fall, about moving fast, about what you leave behind. He thought about what he'd been building over the last 6 months without quite knowing it. Thursdays, the phone calls with Carol, the texts with Thomas, the book in his jacket pocket, the window grip, the reading lamp, and the sourdough bread are from Morrow Street. The small constructions that add up over a lifetime are a record of what you chose to spend your time doing. He thought about Dorothy's glasses on the side table. He thought about the 23-year-old in the photograph laughing at something outside the frame. How she didn't know, in that June of 1963, what was coming. The 54 years, and the daughter, and the grandson, and the back porch, and the lavender, and the fall in the kitchen, and the 7 years of keeping the glasses exactly where she'd left them. He thought, the most important thing about a road is not the distance you can cover on it. The most important thing is where it takes you. And the second most important thing is who's with you when you arrive. He drove through the night. Albert slept. The lavender was on the seat between them. The motorcycle sat at the red light on Birchwood and 5th. Same corner, same October light, warm and golden and slightly heartbreaking. The leaves are doing their annual thing. Jake sat on the bike and waited for the light and thought about exactly 1 year ago, about a crosswalk and an old man with a paper bag and a hip that was sending its impatient messages. He thought about the word grandson. He thought about what a family was and whether it needed to be the thing you were born into, or whether it could also be the thing you walked into. Stepped off a motorcycle in the middle of traffic to help with, ate pasta in the kitchen of, fixed things in, drove 5 hours for, showed up for every Thursday. He thought it could be both. He thought they were not so different. The light turned green. Jake did not kill his engine this time. No one was in the crosswalk. He rode through the intersection, past the point where he'd left his bike a year ago, up 2 blocks, and left on Morrow Street, where he stopped at the bakery and bought a sourdough loaf, the same one Albert liked, and then 4 more blocks to the Birchwood Arms. He parked, took the bread. He nodded to the man at the front door who now knew him by name and said, "He's expecting you, Mr. Calloway," with the warm familiarity of someone who has seen a thing become a fixture. Jake took the elevator to the 4th floor, knocked. Albert opened the door. He wore his cardigan, the oatmeal-colored one from the crosswalk, and his dress shoes, which Albert Novak polished every Thursday and wore regardless of the occasion, believing that Thursdays were always occasion enough. He looked at the bread. "Sourdough," he said. "Good." "I know what you want," Jake said. "You're learning," Albert said. He He stepped back to let Jake in. The apartment was the same. The photographs, the books, and the quilt on the couch. The blue vase on the table. Dorothy's glasses on the side table. The lavender, growing in a pot on the windowsill now, planted in April, is vigorous as promised. Jake took off his jacket and hung it on the hook by the door that had been there since November and had gradually, without announcement, become his hook. He went to the kitchen. "Coffee?" he said. "Already made," Albert said, settling into his armchair. Jake poured 2 cups, brought them out, handed one to Albert, and sat on the couch. The October afternoon moved through the windows. The city engaged in its usual activities outdoors. A piece of music played somewhere, faint, horns, old, and Albert cocked his head slightly, and Jake watched him do it. "Chet Baker," Jake said. Albert's mouth curved. "You've been doing your homework. You're a demanding teacher." "I'm an excellent teacher," Albert said. "The demanding is incidental." They drank their coffee. "Thomas called this morning," Albert said. "He's booked Christmas." "I know. He texted me." Albert shook his head, but the shake contained a smile. "My support network." "We're efficient," Jake said. Outside, the October light continued its beautiful and elegiac work in the world. Inside, the apartment held all those years, all those photographs, the glasses, the book, the lavender, and the 2 cups of coffee on the table. Jake opened the Marcus Aurelius, his copy, the old one, Albert's father's, worn to silk, to no page in particular. "Read me something," Albert said. Jake found a page, found a line, read it aloud. Albert listened with his eyes closed, in his armchair, in his cardigan, in his 84th year, with the lavender on the windowsill and Dorothy's glasses where they belonged, and the October light coming in. And the answer, this exactly, was what Jake had not known he was looking for. Not the road, not the motion. It is not the beautiful, empty freedom of always being between places. This, here, the weight and warmth of being where you belong, with someone who is happy to see you. An old man in an armchair, a cup of coffee, a book full of pencil marks, a Thursday afternoon. Everything. He'd stopped in a crosswalk for a stranger. The stranger had offered him coffee. The coffee had led to soup, and the soup to bread, and the bread to a birthday dinner, and the birthday dinner to a phone call, and the phone call to a drive to Cleveland, and Cleveland to a lavender plant on a windowsill. And the lavender was still growing. As lavender does, as love does, when you remember to water it.